Kia ora koutou. It's a delight to be here today, and I'm hoping Allan Miller has made it. If not, I'm going to be impersonating two people, not just one. This is a story about research. It's a story about research challenges in the demand-side management space, and we'll be covering off two research programs, one called Energy Cultures and one called Green Grid, in a very, very high level and hopefully fun way. See, this is not... Do I need to turn it that way? Right, and it's a story about a journey. And this road represents an energy road. And the road to the future is beset by some particular challenges, one which is climate change and the other which is energy security, and I'm not quite sure which is the worst. And while we're travelling this road, we're also trying to achieve personal well-being for households, we're trying to achieve business productivity, and we're trying to achieve a healthy environment. But where will it end up? Will we end up at Orthanc with its high-tech solutions, but a great deal of pollution for the air and the water? Will we end up at Barradua with its autocracy and high levels of inequality? Or will we end up at Hobbiton at a low-tech and democratic, but possibly quite a different kind of set of living standards than we might expect in Orthanc or Barradua? So ultimately, though, the energy future depends on this relationship here, the relationship between the finger and this bit of gadgetry. And it doesn't matter really what kind of gadgetry it is. But it's all about how do people interact with technology, how do they make decisions and choices, how do they behave in relation to the services that they are seeking. And there are really two main ways of looking at that. And one is engineers and physicists and scientists who are interested in the practical and the physical. And on the other side, there are the social scientists who are interested in how people think and behave. Now, I spent a lot of time on Google Images looking for images of engineers and social scientists. And do you know what? Social scientists always come up like this on the right. And I think there's a whole story about that and how social scientists are actually portrayed in the media, but we won't go there today. But the trouble is, when social scientists and other scientists get together, often the result looks a bit like this. People really talking past each other and not understanding each other. And this was the challenge that we sought with the Energy Cultures framework. And I'm hoping, I just need to go back one here. Can we just switch over now to the sound?
Once upon a time in New Zealand, there was an economist, a physicist, a lawyer, a sociologist, and a consumer psychologist. They were trying to understand why people got locked into certain patterns of behaviour in their energy use, even when it seemed logical to change. But each of their disciplines had a different explanation for this. So they developed a model that made sense to all of them. And it said people develop a distinctive energy culture from the interactions between their norms, what they think is normal or appropriate, their material culture, their technologies and infrastructure, and their energy practices, what they do that uses energy. And these things became self-reinforcing, and they were also influenced by exterior forces like regulations and energy price. And they called this model the Energy Cultures Framework. And gradually, even though it was first just meant to help them work together, they realised that the model could help them understand why people behaved the ways they did, and how to help them change behaviour. First they applied it to households' heating behaviour, then to all energy behaviour in households in New Zealand, and they found clusters of quite distinctive energy cultures. Now they're using the model to help understand how transport systems are changing, to understand the energy culture of growing businesses, and to compare New Zealand's energy culture to other countries. And to their surprise, people all over the world thought the model was really helpful. And so the Energy Cultures Framework became quite a new way of thinking about behaviour and change. And the Energy Cultures team grew to include many more disciplines, like philosophy, geography, IT, politics, education and more. Now the team is working with people all around the world to test and apply the model, so stay tuned to see many more advances from the Energy Cultures team.
What the story goes on to say is that over time the Energy Cultures group also expanded, and here's a picture of the Energy Cultures Fellowship, as we might call it, when we first started the Energy Cultures project 4 years ago, and as you can see, a wide range of disciplines there. And this is the Energy Cultures team now, 15 people with an even wider range of disciplines. So this is what, for the sake of this story, I'm calling the fellowship, and it's really representing the importance of working across disciplines to study these very, very important questions. Now, in the animation, it mentioned briefly some of the ways that we use the ring, as we might call the Energy Cultures Framework. And really, what the framework is saying is it's really important to look at not only individually the physical stuff you've got, what you have, how you think, or your norms, or your expectations, or your aspirations for energy and energy services, and also what you do, but also how those interact with each other and start to build up self-reinforcing patterns or habits that are very hard to break out of. One of the things that we've done with the ring is to apply it to a big study of New Zealand households, and found 4 species of energy users. And those species are quite distinctive clusters. And one of them we call the energy economical. This is people who use as little energy as they possibly can. They tend to live in houses with very poor material culture, uninsulated, cold, terrible heating systems. But their energy practices, what they actually do, are highly efficient because they're trying to save every last dollar. Then we've got the energy extravagant. This speaks for itself. These people tend to live in really big houses. They're not terribly well built necessarily. They use lots of energy. They play with a lot of gadgets. They have high levels of appliances. And in terms of the Energy Cultures Framework, we give both their material culture and their practices a big cross. They can afford to and could potentially change rapidly, but they choose not to. The energy efficient speaks for themselves, and again, really hard to find great images of energy efficient people looking happy on the internet. Another big problem with communication. Energy efficient do all the right things. They have the freezers, they chop their wood for the fire, they wash their dishes, they get big ticks in both. And then the energy easy are people who actually have the right gear, but they prefer to take life easy in terms of their practices. So they might have an energy efficient washing machine, but they'll put a quarter load in order to put it through. What we also find is that there's some kind of life cycle relationship here, and people often are energy economical when they're younger and potentially move through some of these stages, not necessarily, but in some instances, and I can certainly see it in my own life. And I'd just like to have a show of hands who here sees themselves as energy economical. Energy extravagant. Nobody dares put their hands up. Energy efficient. Energy easy. Yeah. If I did this in a group of young people, I'd get a huge number saying energy economical, or even a group of retired people. So let's go on. Also, the ring can help us understand some of those external forces that are specifically affecting our material culture, our norms, and our practices. And we've applied this model in many different ways, but one is looking at global transport and some of the forces for change towards a much more efficient transport system globally. And in that work, we're identifying significant changes in material culture that are coming on board through innovations and developments, and some just through sensible investment in things like buses and cycle lanes. We're seeing changes in practices, for example, car sharing schemes, higher levels of use of public transport in some parts of the world, feedback in cars. and also changes in norms. And what we're seeing, interestingly, here is that younger people in many parts of the world are driving a whole lot less. And it hasn't got much to do with the advertisements on the TV, it's to do with a whole lot of other things as well. And even Boris here, changing the norm of what it is to be a businessman on a suit, on a bike in the middle of London. So when we see all of those things changing, when we see a change in material culture, practices and norms, we say what we're seeing here is an energy transition, something that is quite a big leap, a big step change from one system to another, and that's the sort of thing we're trying to support with our work. Now, just to lead into the Green Grid project, and focusing now on electricity, what might the future of the grid look like? Will it be a monolithic future with huge grid lines like these ones? And I believe it's not a joke. I think these do actually exist in Iceland, but I'm not sure. But will our future be something that has either a dystopian or a utopian but very high energy using sets of civilizations, or will we be moving to something a bit more like this, which is indicating very distributed system, high levels of demand management, local production, and strong engagement. And curiously, this was in the 2007 Labour government-generated energy strategy. So it's an interesting picture of where the political mind was at that point. Now I'm going to move on to Allan, who I believe is here. Allan Miller from the Epicentre at Canterbury University, who's the leader of the Green Grid project.
Well, good morning, everyone. I've only just arrived, so I'm not quite sure what's gone before me, but continuing on with the theme of, is it the Lord of the Rings? Okay, a sort of journey-like theme. I guess what I want to talk about today is my journey with demand response and how that's led to Green Grid. And my journey really started, I guess, when I was quite young on my family's orchard in Brightwater, Nelson, where we had an irrigation system that was powered by a massive, great 1 megawatt induction motor. This thing was enormous, huge thing. Now we were at the end of a long distribution line, so when we switched this thing on to irrigate the orchard, we couldn't operate certain equipment such as televisions and that kind of thing because it was just too much interference. So we had to practice our own form of demand response or demand management by only having that on at certain times. Now in our case that wasn't too bad because you want to irrigate an orchard in the early hours of a morning when we weren't really using much electricity. Stepping forward to 1995, I was involved in some way in the development of the wholesale electricity market in New Zealand, and I worked with a lot of economists at the time, and I was an engineer working with a lot of economists, and whenever I had something to ask them about how the electricity market would work, they would draw a supply and demand curve showing supply, and that's fine, I can understand that, but showing demand. Now, from the point of view of an individual firm in a very competitive retail market, I can see now that you could have an elastic demand, but from the point of view of the overall market, actually, demand is inelastic in an electricity market. People don't really have a choice as to when they use electricity, mainly because it can't be stored. Possibly, we could see some elasticity in demand like this, and we have observed this. And in fact, I've used that in some work before. But my concern at the time was, how can demand have any influence on price? In fact, it doesn't really, I believe. So it's more of a price taker. So it's a supply-oriented market, really. So moving forward to 2000, I got quite passionate about getting some demand response, and I had the opportunity to work in Australia for a utility, and I was in charge of a demand response program there where we hooked up major industry to a demand response program. So the particular one there on the left is a pipeline, water supply pipeline from Perth to Kalgoorlie, and along that, at about 50 to 100 kilometre intervals, because it was 600 kilometres in length, were pumping stations, a couple of megawatts each, perfect for interruption. The one on the right is a cement mill. We also hooked up silicon smelters and MDF plants, and we got, over the course of a year, about 80 megawatts, which for the size of the market there was pretty good. So I think industrial participation is good at the moment, but still limited. I think there's potential for more. But my big question is, what about homes? Homes, I think, contribute in New Zealand through, some homes contribute through hot water heating, load control, but other than that have very little ability really to contribute. They really have to take the price that the retailer gives them, and there's not a lot they can do about it. They can switch to alternative forms of energy for heating, but even that can be expensive. So I think it would be, I think there's an opportunity for homes to contribute more in demand side management in the electricity market. In fact, in the long run, we will see that participation, and in fact, we're seeing it now. There's photovoltaics on the roofs of those houses, and that's one area we're seeing that participation in the long run. People are voting with their feet to move away from their electricity retailer and go to more self-sufficient forms of electricity supply. Unlikely that will be totally self-sufficient for homes, very unlikely, but it is moving some demand away from the whole electricity market. And in fact, we've done, the numbers in New Zealand are pretty low at the moment for PV, although the rate of uptake is exponential. And it is conceivable that by the 2020, 2021, we could have roughly 1 gigawatt of photovoltaics at the current uptake rate. Now, we're trying to put a bit more science around this sort of projection to understand what that could be based on populations and so on. But if that was the case, then PV, photovoltaics, could make up 20 to 30% of the midday capacity of New Zealand's installed capacity. But I would make the point that it would only meet about 4% of New Zealand's energy needs. So it's not a big contributor to renewable energy, but it's great for people because they can really start contributing. Wind generation could exacerbate that by adding to the variability, providing a 50% capacity, say midday, of a variable source of renewables. And just to give you an idea, this is photovoltaic generation from on a nice blue skies day. The sun comes up in the morning, generating full capacity at midday, full energy at midday, and then the sun goes down. So there's a natural sort of variability there with the sun. But if you look at a cloudy day, it's all over the place. And those variations are very rapid. Clouds cross the sun quite rapidly. One of the things we're trying to understand on Green Grid is how that, on a large scale across a lot of homes in New Zealand or in a city and New Zealand, actually translates to variability of supply of renewables. Looking at it across a week, we have a very good day in the first day of the week there, but it progressively gets worse. And wind is not much better. That's an example of wind generation with a nominal capacity of 35 megawatts throughout the course of a day. And you can see some quite large drop-offs in the wind generation at times within a half-hour period. So, what about the short run? Well, this brings us to Green Grid, the bearer of the ring, the saviour of Middle Earth, or New Zealand in this case. What we want to achieve from Green Grid is demand response en masse from homes to deal with renewable variability. And I know that demand response is used elsewhere in the world to provide a balancing supply, or we call it frequency keeping, to deal with variability of supply. And we would like to see that provided by demand response from homes in New Zealand. This has two benefits. Firstly, it will facilitate more renewables into the New Zealand market, and it will bring the demand side, especially homes, to the table, into the market, and actually enable them to actively participate. So I'm going to hand back to Janet now. Okay.
Okay. Just in terms of Green Grid, the project Allan was talking about, a number of us from the Energy Cultures project, mostly social scientists but not all, are also involved with Allan's team of engineers in that project, trying to look at the very question of how do we achieve uptake by households. I'm going to tell you a bit of a hero story within the general ring story here about a community called Blueskin, and this is the Hobbiton of New Zealand in terms of energy development, and it really is starting to live out the possibility that Allan's been alluding to here about much more engagement from communities around PV and around demand response. So Blueskin is a cluster of communities around a bay called Blueskin Bay down in the bottom of the South Island near Dunedin. Around 1,000 households all up across all of those settlements, and not hugely wealthy, sort of middle of the road area. And in 2007 there was a flood there, and the community came together and said, we've actually got to make ourselves more resilient, not only to flooding but also to other potential challenges ahead. And energy was one of the areas that they picked up as something they wanted to work on. And where the community started was in really changing what I would call the norms. And that is bringing people together to learn more about energy, developing energy literacy, understanding what the possibilities were, and creating a common vision about where they might go as a community in the next 10 to 20 years. And this diagram here really indicates what their big vision is, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it's a little bit like that Labor energy strategy picture, in that it has local generation, it has a wind cluster, a community-owned wind cluster, it's got a focus on insulation, LED lighting, and a lot of eco-innovations as well. The pathway that the community has followed actually is remarkably similar to this diagram that they've drawn. Starting off with the energy economical, there's been a lot of focus on insulating homes through with the assistance of eco-subsidies, but also a lot of passion and involvement from people in the community. The energy extravagant have been assisted to get into getting things like washing machines with efficiency ratings and so forth, so a lot better understanding of the importance of buying appliances that are energy efficient. So a move towards people who are much more energy efficient, and also people who are quite happy to be energy easy. But what we're finding is that as people are getting into this kind of response to these challenges, once they've got their house sorted, once they've got their insulation and their double glazing, and they're starting to feel comfortable in their house, they don't want to stop there. So the next step in the journey seems to be PV, photovoltaics. So about 9 months ago, a call went out to people who might be interested in putting PV on their houses. 50 people held up their hands and said, yes, we'd like to be part of a partnership that's buying in container loads of these things. So exciting journey there. There's a lot of focus also on transport, so how to achieve much more efficient transport within that community and between that community and the city where a lot of people work. There's innovators. Here's an innovator who's developed a retrofit electric car, which Malcolm knows quite a lot about and is very impressed by. So the guy who's doing this has now set himself up a workshop and is starting to turn out electric vehicles in ordinary dungaree New Zealand cars that actually pass New Zealand standards. Very exciting. We've been surveying these people to see actually what the energy journeys look like, and one of the things that is emerging is that people also have starting to get an interest in feedback devices. They want to understand how they use energy in their home, particularly once they start generating it. And so this is part of the bigger journey, and it becomes even more important when you get, as you do have, a street full of people in one of the settlements who says, actually, we all want to put PV on our roofs, and we want to form some kind of an enclosed cluster of generators who control supply and demand within our street. Can we do that with current equipment? So this is a question that has the Lines Company scratching their head, but they're working very happily on this issue. And finally, the community also has a very well-developed proposal to become New Zealand's first community-owned wind cluster. This is a mock-up on the hill here. They're not quite there yet, but this is a vision that the community's been working towards for a long time. So a lot of innovation, a lot of uptake, a lot of really forging the path for the first time. A lot of these things that the community is doing are quite novel, but they're possible and they can be adopted by other communities. And all through this, we have been working alongside them, offering research support where they've needed it, and also observing what they're doing through the Energy Cultures framework. And what we're honestly seeing is these big shifts in norms, these shifts in practices, and these shifts in material culture all coming together to create quite a new culture of energy across these communities, reaching out and rippling into places where you wouldn't expect these very normal New Zealanders to even think energy, let alone take action in the ways that they are. So just my last slide, the road continues and where will it end? And I think this is a rather a sobering slide looking at the four reference scenarios used in the IPCC report. Our current rate of global emissions following the red line here, which will get us to between 4 and 6 degrees by 2100, not a good look. And so the question really for us is, are we going to end up with Sauron, with the burning eye, or are we going to end up with Hobbiton down here in the relatively cool 2 degrees? And I'll just leave you with this quote from the OECD. Although there are a number of possible trajectories for reaching the 2-degree target, they all imply a reduction to zero of the net global greenhouse gas emissions in the second half of this century. A huge challenge indeed for energy. Thank you.